right, we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Just in case I forget at the end of class, I did put chapter 27, 28 notes for Acts on the back table next to the chapter 26 notes. So anyone who wants those can pick those up after class. They will be on the website hopefully tonight, if not tonight, tomorrow. All right, Ecclesiastes chapter 2. We have been observing Solomon's take on his observations as he has gone through life and the lessons that he has learned. We noted at the end of last Wednesday night how that Solomon describes the fact that he basically gave himself over to indulgence, to excess, to observing folly and observing all of the experiences that a man can have in this life, to kind of learn the wisdom associated with it. It says he searched in his heart how to gratify his flesh with wine while guiding his heart with wisdom. He was trying to kind of walk the line there, to kind of straddle the fence, to be able to have a little bit of the best of both worlds, to hold on folly, but notice what his ultimate goal was: until I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. In essence, Ecclesiastes, and in particular as Solomon is on this quest, I guess you could say, for wisdom, in essence it's really all kind of revolving around the meaning of life and the observations that lead him to his ultimate conclusion. And all of this, of course, is taking place through the process of the time while he was certainly doing what the Lord wanted him to do, but then also when his heart fell away, and he fell away into worshiping the idols that his wives had. And we talked last week about whether or not his desire to look deeper into kind of the different stages of man and the enjoyment of man, the pleasure of man, whether that prompted his going away from God, or whether his going away from God kind of prompted this kind of search. But when it's all said and done, I tend to think it was the former instead of the latter. I tend to think that his desire to look deeply, I think to a certain extent, if there was a failing of Solomon, and then there may be several we could speculate about, but I think that if there's one that overarching between what we know about Solomon and Ecclesiastes, it was that perhaps he was overconfident that his wisdom would protect him, that his wisdom would keep him from getting lost in the worldly pleasures that he sought to kind of understand the nature of madness and of mirth and so forth. So I tend to think that in some ways his overconfidence is what led to his falling away from the Lord, and ultimately, of course, he was able to come back, which is what Ecclesiastes is, his kind of looking back on his life and the lessons that he's learned. He describes, starting in verse 4, 5, 6, 7, all of the things that he did, and this is not a comprehensive list, certainly, but all the things that he used his wealth to be able to do, to enjoy himself, to accumulate great possessions. And he says in verse 9, I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And I almost look at that verse 9 as kind of a continuation from verse 3, in that there was a point at which he continued to have his wisdom, which is to say he was able to maintain his perspective even while enjoying all of these possessions and these pleasures that he had. And again, nothing specific here in verses 4 through 8 that in and of themselves would be sinful. Okay, in fact, in many ways, I see verses 4 through 8 as kind of all the wealth and all the possessions that he was able to accumulate before he left the service of the Lord. Because everything you read here, it's great, wondrous wealth that certainly you could kind of attribute to his rise as king and this great glory that was associated with that. But then you get to verse 9, or verse 10 specifically. His wisdom remained with him, But then he says in verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. And then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled. And indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Verses 10 and 11, the way I look at verses 10 and 11 is Solomon, he's not just describing a little time period. I believe Solomon is describing this time period where he kind of goes beyond just what he did in verses 4 through 8. It almost sounds like verse 10, he's going beyond where he really should have stopped. Whatever his eyes desired, he did not keep from himself. He didn't withhold his heart from any pleasure. Based on what we know from Solomon's life, and I know he doesn't specifically address any sin on his part at this point, but in verse 11, he looks back on it and says, there was no profit in it. And so I kind of see this as an escalation, and he has gone further now, but he doesn't specifically address that his wisdom had remained with him. And I think at this point, verse 10 is where his wisdom no longer remained with him. He gave himself over fully to all the pleasures and what his eyes desired. And I tend to suggest that verse 10 included that time that he had spent away from serving the Lord, even going as far as to serving these idols and enjoying the excess of pleasure that God did not want him to enjoy, because that was against what God told him to do. And so even before and then after his falling away from God, what his conclusion is, he looked on all the works that his hands had done, verse 11, and on the labor in which he had toiled. He rewarded himself. He enjoyed these excesses, and after it was done, again, not just a little time frame, we're not talking like a year. Okay, we're talking about a broad expanse of his life in some capacity. And he says, indeed, all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. And I'm suggesting verse 11 is including all the way up from verse 4. Okay, verse 11, he's looked on all of it, both from verses 4 through 10, when he was enjoying the pleasures of the wealth within God's will, but also including verse 10, verse 10, when he went away from God. He looked back on all of that and said it was all vanity. It was all grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. In that, what he's going to observe and say is that when you die, you can't take it with you. And so all of these experiences that I had, even while I retained his proper perspective of wisdom before he fell away from the Lord, even all of that, there was no profit. There was no ultimate gain that stayed. And that's really the lasting property of it, the lasting staying power of this wealth and the pleasure that he enjoyed. Thoughts through verse 11. I know Solomon doesn't specifically bear out his falling away from the Lord, but given the fact that we know that did happen, I tend to believe that verse 10 describes an escalation of this where he didn't hold anything back. And he doesn't modify it or clarify it by saying within the will of God. I think he went all out at this point, verse 10, and it wasn't until after he came back to the Lord, he observed it all, and he said, you know what, none of it was a profit. Yes, ma'am.
I guess I'm wondering why you feel like verse 10 isn't just an explanation of 9, like how far he went.
Yeah, because verse 9, when he says, I became great and excelled, he said, also my wisdom remained with me. Right. So it seems as if he observed that his wisdom, he was able to maintain perspective on himself and on the service to the Lord from verses 4 through 8 in what he had accumulated and what he enjoyed.
But why isn't verse 10 just explaining, like, I had my wisdom and this is how far I took it? I mean,
Because I view verse 10 as an escalation. I think he lost his wisdom, verse 10. He fell away from the Lord. It was at that point he delved even deeper to see how far he could push it, just how far he could push the envelope while maintaining his perspective. And he lost himself. That's kind of how putting together what happened in Solomon's life with what he says in verse 10, to me there's an escalation here. Verses 4 through 8 is not an escalation of anything he wanted. It certainly is a huge amount of wealth. But what he observes here with regard to any pleasure that he wanted, he indulged himself in it. To me, that's far and beyond verse 4 through 8. Verse 4 through 8, there's nothing sinful about any of that in and of itself. But verse 10 describes an excess. That is where you get into the sinful properties. And so when he observed that he still had his wisdom in verse 9, it's almost like verse 10, he goes further. He takes that and he goes even further. And again, I tend to think that this is that period of time that he is now falling away from the Lord. He's given himself over completely. And then verse 11, this is when he's come back to himself, where his wisdom has returned. He's come back to the Lord, and he observes what he learned from all of that. But that's why I say that. Yes, yeah, go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
The purchasing, don't send people back to Egypt to purchase horses, because that'll turn their hearts back to Egypt. Solomon did that.
Yeah.
So some of these things in those preceding verses, maybe he hadn't gone to the excess, perhaps, but maybe he has.
So you're suggesting that verses 4 through 8...
I'm not saying all of them
right.
necessarily were sins, but
right.
There's a couple of them, if he has gone to the extent that God prescribed not to back in Deuteronomy 17, then they could have been. That's all. That's the only point I'm making.
Well, and certainly to say that there wasn't at the same time a build-up of what would lead to Solomon letting his heart fall away by marrying all these hundreds of women from all these different places and allowing those influences in his own home or palace, certainly that was a lack of wisdom, okay, or a lack of being aware of perception to see what was happening. So, I mean, I understand 4 through 8 could be a culmination or kind of an overview of verse 10, and that's possible. It's just interesting to me that verse 9, when he says, "My wisdom remained with me," as if he still felt like he was able to walk that line between pleasure and yet still maintaining his wisdom. But then something happened, something changed, where he gave himself over completely and he lost his perspective, his objectivity in serving the Lord to a certain extent. And it might be from verse 4 through 8, this is a build-up leading to verse 10, and that's another way you could look at it. But I certainly look at verse 10, and the reason I say this is because I don't want us to think that Solomon's defending himself or in some way saying he didn't sin at all in this process. I think he absolutely did, and I think that's part of what he's observing here, that he absolutely did sin in what he did, which is part of what he's observing in that I didn't gain anything in all of this. And it's going to lead to a lot of the observations going into chapter 3 regarding man and these things that he chooses to enjoy, and ultimately leading to the conclusion that since none of this matters, why give yourself to it? Why lose your perspective on serving the Lord when your entire purpose is to fear God and keep His commandments? Because God's going to bring an account. In fact, He even mentions youth. I think it's in chapter 11, where there's a certain limit of what youth should be willing to do and enjoy, because God will bring an account of those days. So there's Solomon looking back on his time with objectivity, but also with a certain sense of regret. I tend to think that he looks back with a certain sense of regret that he allowed himself to go this far. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I know that man put in all the verses, and
yeah.
I'm reading the English Standard, so it's written in paragraphs and stuff like
yeah.
that. is one paragraph.
Yeah.
And so, when I read it, I totally agree with you that Solomon, to me, when you read verse 9 through 11, and he said, look, I was wise, and let me tell you, I indulged everything I could indulge, and it was worth nothing.
Yeah.
So to me, 10 makes 9. If you did all of that and you retained your wisdom through all of it, I mean, listen to this man, because if he kept his wisdom through all of it, because keeping wisdom and leaving God are two separate things.
Sure. Yeah.
So if he kept his wisdom and still indulged every pleasure that he ever had, whether it be physical or of the eye or whatever, and he comes and the wisest man says, and it was all for nothing.
Sure.
Look how much we can gain from that.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. And as we noted last week and the week before that, that just because someone's wise does not mean there's different kinds of wisdom. Okay, there's what we would call street smarts. Okay, there's book smarts, that there's a certain amount of wisdom you can gain by learning. But then the wisdom that you gain as someone with a spiritual mindset and a spiritual perspective is a totally different set of wisdom. And what Solomon ends up promoting is that spiritual wisdom. That's what he ends up at the end of chapter 12, where he describes the writing of many books, there is no end, and all of this. It's almost as if he's culminating to, out of all of the wisdoms that are available to you, here's the most important one, to focus on God and on serving Him. Verse 9, when he describes this, and again, like I said, I connected it to verse 3, while guiding his heart with wisdom on how to lay hold on folly till he might see what was good for the sons of men. To me, this was an effort on his part not to just give an excuse to indulge. I think he had I don't need to say a scholarly motivation or a desire to kind of understand the nature of man's experience on this earth, but there was certainly an objective purpose in why he was doing this. This wasn't just for the sake of having fun, we might say. There was a purpose behind it. And so when he gets to verse 9, he says, I enjoyed all of this, and I still was able to maintain or have my wisdom. But then verses 10 and 11, and really as he gets to verse 12 and 13 on down, there was not to say that his physical wisdom didn't leave him. It certainly did. It remained. But I tend to look at this more so as his better judgment, his greater judgment in relation to God. Because God's going to be mentioned all throughout Ecclesiastes. Over and over again, God is mentioned. It is a focal point. It is kind of the basis upon which the lessons he learned is because of his respect to God and what God told him. And so when he looks at this from verse 10 and 11, it's interesting to me that when he observes the excess that he went to, it's almost as if he's describing, and it was, a full lack of wisdom in giving himself over completely to this. And whether verses 4 through 8 is a part of that excess and giving over, certainly you could say it's certainly a buildup, for sure. But obviously all of it, and I think verse 11 is incorporating from verse 4 all the way down. None of it made any difference. None of it matters in the end. None of this gained me anything. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and I think the takeaway for me in this is that when he was serving God, it meant something. But when he started serving himself, it was all for nothing.
Yeah. And this was a personal quest. It wasn't like God told him, now I want you to understand the nature of man in the world. That wasn't what God told him to do. This was a personal quest of his. And again, you can associate this also with perhaps some overconfidence, overzealousness on his part, but this is an answer he wanted. This was something he sought. Which leads to, ultimately, again, as we noted, what he learned from this was street smarts doesn't get you to heaven, book smarts doesn't get you to heaven. No, we're not talking about the Bible. Spiritual smarts is what gets you to heaven. Spiritual wisdom, having the understanding of what God wants you to do and doing it, that's what gets you to heaven. And this is what he learned from all of this.
In 1 Kings 11, verse 9, it says, the Lord was angered with Solomon which had appeared to him twice and told him not to do these kinds of things.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Previously, the chapter said he did evil.
Yeah.
Solomon.
And so verses 4 on through verse 11 really kind of, I think, would incorporate those efforts of his own to enjoy these pleasures. Yeah. Anything else through verse 11?
Maybe a different angle. At the end of verse 10, he talks about enjoying what he did.
Yeah.
He said, I'm trying to,
Sorry.
my heart rejoiced in all my labor.
Yeah.
And we can do things that are enjoyable.
Sure.
But when we look back on it, verse 11, you realize then it was a waste of time
Yeah.
to do these things that were enjoyable to do.
Right.
But, reflecting back on it, and him being, why did he ask God for wisdom in the first place?
He wanted to rule well.
He wanted to rule well.
Yeah.
And to rule or to judge or to help the children of Israel, maybe that's why he tried all these things, so he could say, I did that.
Been there.
It wasn't a good idea.
Right.
Versus someone who says, well, I would think,
Yeah.
this would be the best thing to do. I've never done it before.
Right.
But here, with this experience, he's like, I tried that, and this is what you get out of it, and it's not worth the time.
Yeah.
Type thing. And you can appreciate someone
Sure.
who's done or experienced, the loss of a parent, the loss of a child, a hard time, loss of a job, anything like that. Someone can give some experience from that and how to recover
Yeah.
from things like that. And that's where I see him asking God, and God gave him the wisdom that even without that experience, he could judge because God gave him that wisdom.
Yeah.
But then he added experience in along with it, which is part of what wisdom is.
Sure.
Is making good decisions based on your experience and your knowledge.
Right.
And like you said, street smart, common sense, being able to problem solve. That's what all this wisdom
Yeah.
is.
And some of the hardest lessons learned really do come from life experience. And I think his whole reason for writing this is so that you don't have to make these same mistakes. You don't have to go through this process to understand or realize that this is where your heart needs to be, that this is what your objectivity needs to be. And to be fair, at the end of verse 10, he's going to say later that this is what, man should enjoy the works of his hands. But he says that from the perspective of a limit within God's will, okay, is what's implied by what he says. To enjoy the work of your hands, this is your reward from God. This is what you have, but understand and keep it in the proper perspective that it's not going to last. Nothing of this is going to last. And it's not going to go with you. There's not going to be any ultimate profit in it. So just like Doug said, we can take enjoyment from things. We can take pleasure in things within what God has told us that we can. But going beyond that, the excess, for instance, that is where it's as if we're saying that our heart, a couple of weeks ago, I think we had a lesson on where our heart is, or where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. A couple of Wednesday nights ago, one of our men, I think, mentioned that. And that's part of kind of what this is that sometimes when you give over to excess and you give over to the pleasures he's describing, all of a sudden it can take your heart away from heaven. It can put it here on earth. Yes, ma'am?
It kind of a mirror image of the lesson you brought Sunday about the prodigal son.
Yeah.
He had to get to the bottom depths of it, and Solomon took it the other direction because he was rich and had all this knowledge, and they both decided it was best to come back to God, serve the one that could provide for them.
Yeah, that is interesting because instead of hitting rock bottom, Solomon would have hit the ceiling, I guess you could say, or something, and caused him to kind of
They
come
both
back
went
down.
far away from their
Yeah,
father,
yeah,
you know.
that's true. Yeah. Anything else through verse 11? All right, going on to verse 12. Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. And he's describing the man who becomes king after, one who succeeds the king, the one who's next in line. What can he accomplish? Well, we can see through history the pharaohs and the Caesars and the kings that tried to outdo the other. Okay, this is how we ended up getting things like the pyramids, all right, and these great cities that were built and these great monuments that were built. It's like each one was trying to establish his legacy or trying to outdo the other. But really, in the end, he's only doing what the other tried to do, which really ultimately is to be remembered. That really, when it boils down to it, from that vein of trying to put your stamp on your civilization, you're trying to establish a legacy that won't be forgotten. And in many ways, we don't really talk about it a lot because I think other fears that we have tend to take perhaps a broader scope in our minds, like fear of death or whatnot, fear of something happening to loved ones. But being forgotten that really is in the human psyche. It really is. And we don't like to think about it, and we don't like to really dwell on it too much. But being forgotten is a fear that people have. And Solomon says there's no reason to be afraid of it because it's going to happen. That's the bottom line. It's going to happen. Because that's just the nature of man. Nothing lasts forever. So he says in verse 13, I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. So he observed that wisdom is far better than folly. And by folly, he means things that were silly, things that were... And he's not saying that it's not good to laugh, that it's not good to relax. That's not Solomon's point. But the giving of yourself over to them, that wisdom is better than folly, just as light excels darkness. If you have a preference, you prefer to see where you're going and what you're doing. And he describes folly as darkness, and this is what's going to lead to the foolish man here in verse 14. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness, yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. So when he says the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness, what does he mean? Of course, all men's eyes are in their head, you know. But what does Solomon mean, and especially given off what he says, verse 13? Wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. And then he relates that to a wise man's eyes. Okay. And of course, wisdom and understanding they go hand in hand, don't they? Okay. Understanding means you are able to understand connections between facts and how they're used. You're able to see connections in cause and effect. Understanding is being able to observe and learn. Okay, I wouldn't say understanding is synonymous with wisdom. I think technically that they're still two separate things, but understanding and wisdom certainly go hand in hand. So when the wise man's eyes are in his head, where are the foolish man's eyes? If the wise man's eyes are in his head, and he's focused on learning, and he's focused on growing, and he's likening this between wisdom and folly, where's the foolish man's eyes? Focused on being entertained. They're focused on being entertained. That's what the pursuit of folly is, to constantly be entertained, not to be thinking. Okay, you know how sometimes you get home from work and you just want to veg out. You don't want to think, you just want to veg. Okay, you just want to kind of just sit there and do something mind-numbing because your brain feels overworked and you just kind of just want to relax your brain for a while. Okay, I think everybody at some point has been there. All right, well, what Solomon is describing is someone who that's all they want. They don't want to do any thinking. They don't want to do any processing or understanding anything. They just want to laugh. They just want to be entertained. Their eyes, or what they're seeking, is not in their head. It's on stuff, huh?
Closed.
Oh, yeah.
Eyes are closed.
Yeah, they're closed. Absolutely. And that likens between light and darkness, because a wise man can see what it is he needs to do and where he needs to go, whereas the foolish man, he's blind, but he doesn't even care because he's being entertained. Yet I myself perceived that the same event happens to them all. What happens to them all? Life and death. Yeah, events of life are going to happen to them, and death's going to happen to them. Anything through verse 14 so far? Verse 15, so I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. Why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever. Since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. So Solomon, as he is observing this fact about wise men and those who pursue folly, and for that matter, those who pursue madness, when he says, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me, why was I then more wise? What is the purpose in seeking to understand? What is the purpose in seeking to learn all of this? He said in his heart, this also is vanity, not the pursuit of knowledge. That's not what's vanity. What Solomon is observing is that the difference between the wise man and the foolish man should mean what? What in the mind of someone who is wise, how should that work out?
Better than
The end result for the wise man should be better than the end result for the foolish man, shouldn't it? And especially as he applies verse 16, what should it be regarding those who are wise over those who are foolish in the minds of others? They should be remembered. And to be fair, is he right? Shouldn't we probably exalt and remember and have as role models people who are wise over those people who are foolish, but they're cool? Shouldn't that be the case? Should be. But Solomon says there is no remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. History tends to, really in a lot of ways, history is built by main events, okay? Big events. When we think about the 40s, 30s and 40s, we think about World War II. You think about the teens, you think about World War I. Our history is built on events that people remember because they affected so many people in a deep way. But things that maybe didn't have an impact, but were perhaps even as important to individuals, maybe not as important to generations, but as important to individuals, successes people had, those things maybe aren't remembered, or at least certainly not by an entire civilization. And that's really a sadness in a way. And this is what Solomon is observing, that no matter how knowledgeable or how wise a person is, they're going to be just as easily forgotten as a foolish one is. There is no remembrance. The same event happens to them all. Life happens, death happens, and people forget them. That happens to everybody. How does the wise man die as the fool? First of all, he dies. And the second of all, he dies and is ultimately forgotten. Anything through verse 16. Verse 17. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind. This is part of what gives Ecclesiastes its bad rap, so to speak, in that when sometimes people read Ecclesiastes and they say, man, it's a major drag. It's depressing, it's sad, and it makes you hate life. But this is why Solomon is writing this, because he went through all of those same experiences to the point that he hated life too, until he learned or gained the perspective and the objectivity to recognize what the final lesson was. And so when he says, I hated life because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, in that life happens to the wise and the fool, death happens to the wise and the fool, and both are forgotten. It makes no difference. And that's distressing. And it's distressing that all the things you can accumulate, all the things you can enjoy, all that's just passing. There's no gain, there's no profit in it. So he says it's all vanity and grasping for the wind, because the work that was done under the sun has no ultimate profit. When the focus is just about the mortal, physical, and that's what his point is, that all this means nothing. And that's distressing to me, because what's the meaning of life? Verse 18, then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. I'm sure it was frustrating too. I think about individuals who start companies, and over the period of decades, they build up a company, and it's strong, and it's profitable, and then they retire, somebody else takes over, and they run it right into the ground. And I've known of individuals where that's happened, and they were bitter because of all their work, all the time, all the 18-hour days they put in, and this other fellow comes in, or other woman comes in and just runs it into the ground, and they just ruined it all, their life's work. But then I've known others who didn't care. They said, listen, it makes no difference. It doesn't matter. I did my work for my family and to be able to support them, get my kids through school. Somebody else comes in and runs to the ground. That happens. And so when Solomon is, and consider running a business or owning a business versus being king over an entire kingdom are two completely different things. So when he's considering all the effort, all the work he's put in, and certainly we can observe throughout the Old Testament in the history of the kings, how as the king went, the rest of Israel went, didn't it? Seems like with every king that came along, depending on what their leaning was, certainly before the kingdom split, but each king that would, or after the kingdom split, I meant, but every king seemed to leave their imprint on Israel. We know, especially when it came to the two kingdoms between Israel and Judah, Israel didn't have a single good one. Imagine at least some of how Israel's history might have been different if they'd had at least just one good one. Judah at least has some good kings. But you think about Saul and his influence over Israel. And then there was David, and how David, he brought things back to where they needed to be. He served God. Solomon then expanded it tenfold in terms of wealth and power. And Solomon, just by observing that fact, who knows what's going to happen after I'm gone? Well, what do we know? His son ruined it, didn't he? He ruined it by listening to these young fellas telling him, don't give the people what they want. If you think my father was hard on you, I'm going to be 10 times as hard. And instead of listening to Solomon's advisors, he ruined it, and the kingdom split. And if that young man had had just half the wisdom Solomon had had, our history might be very different. Yes, ma'am?
I think this should be a wake-up call for us as far as if you put it in relation to the church. That
Yeah.
we need to be sure that the future of the church, it's not about us, it's about being sure their faith is their own.
Absolutely.
And if their faith is their own and they adhere to the gospel, then the Lord's body will be okay.
There is a common theme among churches of Christ today where it seems like the demographics keep getting older and older, and there's not as many young people who are strong in the faith prepared to take over the reins, so to speak, as being elders and deacons, because there's not as many focused on what's important. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up with verse 18 and 19 next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments. Don't forget Acts 27 and 28 are on the back table.